So let's start. As I've been saying, you're watching Promethean Actions weekly class for February 8th, 2025. This is Tony Pappert speaking to you from the Detroit area. Tonight's class is on the real President William McKinley by Bob Ingram of California, the author of many books on American history and known to many of you. Um, I think Bob will show us tonight. Now, McKinley is a figure that Trump has been citing and pointing to for several years, most immediately on the precedent of tariffs. And tariffs as a device to um, expand American industry as well as produce tax revenue, which could displace the income tax as a source of federal revenue. And President Trump has spoken warmly of President McKinley, and I think Bob Ingram will show us tonight that McKinley was really one of the great American presidents. So, with that, let me pass it to Bob Ingram.
Hi, everyone. So, yes, McKinley. And w- w- we could title this presentation William McKinley's Challenge to British Imperial Rule. And people don't generally think of McKinley that way, but hopefully by the end of this discussion tonight, that will become more and more clear. Um, I will just say that, yes, Trump clearly has been talking about McKinley, about the tariffs. Um, he's reinstituted McKinley's name on Mount McKinley in Alaska, the highest peak in the United States. But people might still think of McKinley as sort of you know, a, a peripheral issue, uh, just sort of, we wouldn't be talking about him if except for the fact that Trump is talking about him. And I don't know, some accusation that maybe we're trying to curry favor with Trump by talking about McKinley. But I will just say here um, that McKinley was absolutely one of the greatest presidents in the history of the United States. And I truly believe that an argument could be made that he is the greatest president up until our current president, Trump. He is our greatest president after Lincoln and Washington. Now, some might disagree with that, but I think there is a great, great underestimation of what a historic leader McKinley actually was. Now, it's true, that generally when people think about McKinley, they think about the tariff. And as Donald Trump has emphasized, the enormous explosion of productive economic growth under the McKinley president, which then sort of continued into the Roosevelt administration. But that is not an exaggeration. It's all true. That and I'll talk. I'm not going to dwell on the tariffs tonight. I'm going to bring them up a little bit later to say a couple of things about them. But it is true that under McKinley, there was this massive expansion of manufacturing, of energy production, of steel production, of railroads, of machine tool production, as well as the electrification of the United States. These things did not start under McKinley, but they exploded in depth and breadth all across the country during the McKinley presidency as a result of both his tariffs and also of his credit policies, which are generally completely unknown, which I will go into. But just an explosion of this kind of productive economic activity. And I'll just give you two little examples. But you could find many, many more of these things. One is that in 1897, while McKinley was in the White House, a man named Ransom Olds founded the Oldsmobile Corporation, automobile corporation, and he was the first one to use the assembly line, which was later adopted by Henry Ford very successfully. But it was introduced by Olds in 1897 for the manufacturing of automobiles. So this began, a revolutionary breakthrough in industrial manufacturing. Also, during the McKinley presidency in 1900, the Wright brothers established their base for their experiments in manned fixed-wing aircraft flight. They established their base at Kitty Hawk to begin those experiments, which then resulted 3 years later in their first successful flight. But this began during the McKinley presidency. This is what was occurring. A massive explosion of industry, of technology, of science, of productive investment during the McKinley presidency. It was unprecedented. Now, what I'm going to begin with here, though, is uh, I'm going to begin with by trying to present to you as best I can the strategic picture of what was going on. And I'm going to begin with a short quote from McKinley's first inaugural address. He was elected in 1896, November of 1896, was sworn in as president in March of 1897. And very few people have ever read McKinley's inaugural address. And it might come as a surprise to you that he spends a great deal of time. You could even call it the main subject, although he covers a lot of things in the address. You could even call it the main subject of the inaugural address. He spends a great deal of time talking about his proposal and his initiative for bimetallism. Uh, and for those not familiar with that term, what without going into too many details, this is a proposal to use both gold and silver as the basis for legal tender currency in the United States, and also as the basis for settling both domestic and global financial accounts. That the value of the US dollar would be based on a fixed rate between silver and gold. And I'll read you a short quote from this. And it goes as follows. The question of international bimetallism will have early and earnest attention. It will be my constant endeavor to secure it by cooperation with the other great commercial powers of the world. Until that condition is realized, when the parity between our gold and silver money springs from and is supported by the relative value of the two metals, the value of silver already coined and of that which may hereafter be coined, must be kept constantly at par with gold by every resource at our command. The credits of the government, the integrity of its currency, and the inviolability of its obligations must be preserved. This was the commanding verdict of the people, and it will not be unheeded. And I can tell you, that's the end of the quote, that during particularly the first year, he didn't really give up on it, but during the first year of his presidency, McKinley spent a great deal of time trying to organize an international conference to get agreements between most of the major powers in the world for the adoption of a bimetallic standard. Um, And he got agreements. The French agreed to attend the conference. The Germans agreed to attend the conference. The Spanish agreed to attend the conference. And other nations either agreed or were interested in it. And it was blocked by the British. The British absolutely refused to participate in such a conference. And as a result of which, it never occurred. Now, why am I beginning this way? Why is this important? Because what McKinley was doing, there are two aspects to it. And the most important aspect to it is that what he was doing was posing a direct challenge to the global British gold standard. By the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century, the British gold standard essentially ruled the world financially. This began really going all the way back to the Napoleonic Wars when the British adopted the gold standard, but it intensified as the 19th century went on. And by the late 19th century, it was like an iron grip out of the city of London. The British had the largest gold reserves in the world. And through their control over the gold standard, they were able to attack, to sabotage, to manipulate the foreign currencies, the foreign banking systems of every country in the world. In fact, they did it in 1893, which I'll get into a little bit later, in the United States. But this gave them blackmail power, where they could bludgeon nations into obedience on banking and monetary policy. And what McKinley was doing with his attempts to organize an international conference on bimetallism, he was saying that we're going to change this arrangement, and we're going to bring silver in, and we're going to mint silver and keep it at a parity with gold. This will vastly expand the amount of credit that is available nationally, and it will break the British control, primarily because of the huge silver deposits which were being uncovered in the United States. So this was a direct attack to the British gold standard. Now, also, what this meant domestically in the United States is that one of the problems, particularly after the Specie Resumption Act, which was enacted in 1876, and then when it finally went into effect, and the last of the greenbacks, Lincoln's greenbacks, which were not backed by gold, were withdrawn in 1879, and thereafter and throughout the 1880s and into the 1890s, there was this massive shortage of credit in the United States. Farmers couldn't get loans. Manufacturing concerns couldn't get loans. People involved in all kinds of productive activity and trade couldn't get loans because the amount of credit was restricted by the fact that the dollar was tied to gold, and there simply was not enough gold available to provide the credit that was required. And McKinley was one of the individuals who tried to break this gold stranglehold on credit. And this goes back to when he was in Congress. In 1890, he was the co-sponsor, and 1890 was the same year as the McKinley tariff, which raised tariff rates to 50% or close to 50%. It was the highest tariffs in American history. And in the same year that McKinley, proposed and was successful in getting adopted, the McKinley tariff, he was the co-sponsor of the Silver Purchase Act. The prime sponsor was John Sherman, the brother of William Tecumseh Sherman. but McKinley was the co-sponsor on it, and they got the Silver Purchase Act enacted, which did, bring about a domestic monetization of silver, and led to an expansion of credit in the United States, from 1890 up until for the next few years. And there was more of a flow of credit into productive economic activity. But there were two problems. One is that the Silver Purchase Act was repealed by the Democrat Grover Cleveland when he became president in 1893. And secondly, it really couldn't work um, unless other nations in the world, I mean, ultimately, it did have a lot of beneficial effects, but ultimately it could not work unless other nations in the world adopted the same standard, because the what was required in order for it to work was that there had to be a fixed parity, an agreement among every major nation in the world that they would maintain a fixed parity between gold and silver, a fixed exchange rate between gold and silver. But if only the United States was doing that, and otherwise silver was floating, the value of silver was floating in the free market worldwide, it was very easy for the British to undermine the silver monetization in the United States. So this was a fierce battle that McKinley waged on behalf of a um, the a global bimetallic monetary standard, and it is generally completely forgotten about today. Almost no one knows about it, but it was an attempt essentially to put world monetary affairs on a completely different standing than what had existed under the British gold standard. Now, McKinley did something else to undermine the 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 British Empire during his administration. Now, and I've talked about this before, but it definitely has to be talked about tonight. Uh, Everyone knows about the McKinley tariffs, or they maybe don't know a lot about it, but people have heard of it. McKinley sponsored the 1890 tariff. That's the McKinley tariff. Grover Cleveland then lowered the tariff when he came in. But when McKinley came back in 1897, he raised the tariff back up to what it had been in 1890, or very close to it. So you did have these very high tariffs, which had all of these beneficial results. But then McKinley did something else, something which was a deadly threat to the British imperial rule, which is he adopted this policy of what is called reciprocity. And this was a policy that had been proposed and talked about for a long time by the Republican senator from Maine, James Blaine. But McKinley pushed this, he made this a centerpiece of his administration. Now, what is it? What's reciprocity? Um, the It's a policy whereby uh, the United States says we are going to have a sovereign policy of high protective tariffs, both for revenue, but more importantly, to protect and promote the growth of our productive economy in the United States. However, what we are going to do, reciprocity, is we are going to negotiate agreements among sovereign nations in which uh, we will find ways to conduct our trade, country by country. It will vary, but we will, in agreements with various sovereign nations, we will negotiate how to arrange and conduct our trade, which will be mutually beneficial for both of the nations involved, both for ourselves and for the people we are negotiating with. So we might eliminate tariffs on some of their goods. They might lower or eliminate tariffs on some of our goods. We will decide, we will agree that they will be, we will accept their goods in certain areas. They will accept our goods in certain areas, and that the goods that we import from them will help us. The goods we export to them will help them, and we will work together for the economic development of both nations involved. And we will do this nation after nation after nation. Now, not only does this make sense economically, but what does this mean? It means a world of sovereign nations, not a world where trade, banking, financial policy are dictated from London, but a world in which sovereign nations are negotiating among themselves in complete sovereignty around policies which will be mutually beneficial economically. So you put this policy of reciprocity together with McKinley's intensive fight for a global bimetallic standard, monetary standard. This is a deadly threat to the control of the British Empire, to the monetary and banking control of British rule. And I'm going to read you another quote from McKinley, which is an excerpt, and I think I've read this before, but really I should read it again. It's an excerpt from the speech he gave at the Buffalo Exposition in 1901. This was the last major speech McKinley gave in his life. He was assassinated the day after he gave this speech. And the speech is primarily on reciprocity. And it goes as follows. At the beginning of the 19th century, there was not a mile of steam railroad anywhere in the world. Now there are enough miles to make its circuit many times. Our capacity to produce has developed so enormously, and our products are so multiplied, that the problem of more markets requires our urgent and immediate attention. By sensible trade arrangements, which will not interrupt our home production, we shall extend the outlets of our increasing surplus. Reciprocity is the natural outgrowth of our wonderful industrial development. Let us remember that our interest is in concord, not conflict, and that our real eminence rests in the victories of peace, not those of war. We hope that all who are represented here may be moved to higher and nobler effort for their own and the world's good, and that out of this city may come not only greater commerce and trade for us, but more essential than these, relations of mutual respect, confidence, and friendship, which will deepen and endure. Our earnest prayer is that God will graciously vouchsafe prosperity, happiness, and peace to all of our neighbors, and like blessings to all the peoples and powers of the earth. So that's McKinley. That's all I'm going to read from that quote. But bear in mind, this is the peak of the British Empire. the 1890s. This is the Victorian age, going into the Edwardian age of the British Raj in India, of the British gold standard. And this is McKinley, saying peace, happiness, friendship among sovereign nations, economic policies which will benefit all. And this is what McKinley was doing. This is who he was. Um, and and today you get some of these morons, and I will call them morons, uh, you know, uh, because they are, um, who fall for the line or who spout the line that American imperialism began with William McKinley. You know, I mean, this is one of the lines of this, uh, you know, excuse for a historian, one of the worst historians who's ever lived. You can't even call him a historian. Howard Zinn, who wrote this People's, whatever it is, People History of America or something, accusing McKinley of the man who brought in American imperialism. You know, I mean, this is the big lie. This is the big lie. You think, that people lie about Trump, saying Trump's a racist, Trump's this, Trump's that. Well, this is the big historical lie about McKinley. Um, you know, you had the Spanish-American War in 1898. But let's look at it a little bit. First of all, let's not, you have to recognize that Spain was not just some benign power, the friendly Spanish, that we attacked because we wanted to seize Cuba or seize the Philippines. Look, Spain, the Spanish Empire was one of the most evil creations in the history of the human species, really. I mean, they were in at the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade, with the Portuguese. They brought millions of slaves into the Western Hemisphere. They were the last European nation to abolish slavery in the colonies. So they were the first, together with the Portuguese, and the last to abolish slavery in the colonies. Um, Spain did not abolish slavery in their colonies, which included the Philippines and Cuba and Puerto Rico and everything else. Spain did not abolish slavery in their colonies until 1886. 1886. And, you know, uh, and even after they abolished slavery, it really continued to exist de facto. At the time of the Spanish-American War, there were more than 500,000 de facto slaves in Cuba alone. Um, you know, uh, you know, they were free in name only. Um, and I can tell you that the Spanish colonies, um, uh, everywhere in the world, were among the most brutal, the most murderous. I mean, they were really only rivaled by the Dutch. They were worse than the British and the French. The Spanish colonies and the Dutch colonies were absolutely murderous in how they treated the native populations. Um, and this was Spain. This was Spanish rule in Cuba and in their other colonies. It was so brutal that a revolt broke out in Cuba against Spanish rule in the 1870s. It lasted almost 10 years. There were hundreds of thousands of Cubans slaughtered by the Spanish to put down that revolt. It was, the United States had nothing to do with it. This was an indigenous revolt against Spanish rule. The Spanish put it down with murderous brutality. Um, then in 1895, 2 years before McKinley took office, in 1895, another revolt broke out. And, there was just enormous bloodshed and killing. And in 1895, 1896, 1897, the Cubans who were revolting were pleading with the United States to come to their aid, to send troops, to militarily side with them against their Spanish oppressors. They sent telegrams to Congress, letters to the White House, issued statements that were published in American newspapers. Not the warmongers in Washington or elsewhere. The people who were fighting for their freedom in Cuba sent messages to the United States saying, please, please, please come and help us and intervene. So, you get a little. Picture of it. Um, Now, McKinley, um, when he was sworn in March, Grover Cleveland, I mean, this thing was so advanced that, the U.S. Congress in 1896 unanimously passed a resolution, unanimously, Republicans and Democrats passed a resolution stating their solidarity with the Cuban rebels. This was not a declaration of war, but it was a message of support in 1896. There was enormous sympathy in the United States for the Cuban rebels. Um, and the um, and the when Grover Cleveland left office, he left a message for McKinley saying, "I am leaving you a war with Spain." So, the fact is, at the point that McKinley was sworn in 1897, the drumbeat for war was far advanced in the United States. And then you had these people, like uh, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, and people know all the stories about that. Hearst saying, I'll give you, you give me the picture, I'll give you a war or something, whatever Hearst said. Yeah, you had these Anglophiles who were lobbying for war. McKinley resisted it. He openly supported the Cuban Revolution, but he resisted the war drive, um, and he spent the first year in office trying to find a negotiated settlement. He opened up intensive discussions with the Spanish government. He was pressuring the Spanish government, to grant Cuba independence. He was working with Pope Leo the 13th in the Vatican. He wanted to hold a peace conference. He worked intensively for a peace, for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. But then, and this went on long after the Maine was sunk in the Cuban harbor. Long after the Maine was sunk, McKinley continued to try to negotiate a settlement to this. And then the person who took the action, which actually sort of sparked the war, was none other than Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was the Undersecretary of the Navy. And there was a period where, for about a day, this was in 1898, for about a day, when the Secretary of the Navy, whose name I don't recall, when the Secretary of the Navy was out of Washington, D.C., and Teddy Roosevelt was the second in command of the Department of the Navy, Roosevelt sent a telegram to Admiral Dewey in over by the Philippines, basically directing him to begin military operations against the Philippines. So, and Dewey took his fleet and set sail for Manila, you know, and it was like one of these things, you know, like the Russian mobilization in World War One. Once you set something into military mobilization, it's very hard to call them back. And because of Roosevelt's telegram to Dewey, the Navy was mobilized and sailed for Manila. At which point it really became impossible. And just a side note on Teddy Roosevelt, the during that period of time, uh, Teddy Roosevelt was working extremely closely, and I mean extremely closely. You could really almost say, you know, they were working together to accomplish this goal. Teddy Roosevelt was working extremely closely with a man named Sir Cecil Spring Rice. Cecil Spring Rice, who afterwards became the U.S. ambassador to the British ambassador to the United States. And and you know, to give you a sense of how close they were, um, uh, 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 Sir Cecil Spring Rice was the best man at Teddy Roosevelt's wedding, and later the Teddy Roosevelt became the godfather to one of Sir Cecil Spring Rice's children. Later in 1916, 1917, when he was the British ambassador to the United States, Spring Rice played a critical role in getting the Wilson administration to enter World War One and declare war on Germany. So this was the role of Teddy Roosevelt there. So McKinley couldn't stop the war. He just couldn't stop it. It was impossible. Congress was ready to vote overwhelmingly to declare war. It just became something which could no longer be prevented. But when he signed the declaration of war after Congress passed it, McKinley issued a statement. And I'm going to read to you a little quote from that statement. And he says, as soon as we are in possession of Cuba and have pacified the island, it will be necessary to give aid and direction to its people to form a government for themselves. This should be undertaken at the earliest moment, consistent with safety and assured success. It is important that our relations with this people shall be of the most friendly character and our commercial relations close and reciprocal. It should be our duty to assist in every proper way to build up the waste places of the island, to encourage the industry, to encourage education, and to assist them to form a government which shall be free and independent, thus realizing the best aspirations of the Cuban people. Spanish rule must be replaced by a just, benevolent, and humane government created by the people of Cuba themselves. So that's McKinley. Um, Now I could go on this, and there's other quotes I can make on McKinley and the British, um, including from a speech McKinley gave in 1888 when he was in Congress, attacking the British Empire and attacking the British policy of free trade. But you know, there's only so much I can read, and I still have things I want to get through. Um, so the uh, I mean, you know, one of the problems here is McKinley has a very interesting life. And, you know, someone criticized one of my earlier discussions of McKinley, saying I didn't go into enough on who McKinley was. And that's true. I mean, there's just not enough time to do all that. I do want to say a couple of things. Um, he was born in 1843. He was a Civil War veteran. In fact, in 1861, after the firing on Fort Sumter, he enlisted as a private in the Union Army. He rose through the ranks. He was promoted repeatedly, both for his intelligence, but also acts of battlefield bravery, and he eventually attained the rank of major. And the Later in life, he didn't insist on it, but he preferred, even when he was president, to be addressed by his rank of major. And Someone once asked him why, and he said, "Well, all these other things, all these other titles I've had, a lot of them were given to me, or I acquired them one way or another, but the rank of major I earned." And He was a major in the war. Um, he did not come from some elite background. He grew up and was raised in northern Ohio, um, what's called the Western Reserve region of Ohio, which was a center of manufacturing, of industry, of productive economic activity. Um, uh, uh, he had grandparents on both sides of his family who were iron workers, and one of his grandfathers actually forged cannon during the Revolutionary War for George Washington's army. So this is the kind of working class industrial background he comes out of. His family were also abolitionists, and I'll give you a short quote from McKinley's mother. She says, quote, "The McKinleys were very strong abolitionists, and William early imbibed very radical views regarding the enslavement of the colored race." And I can tell you that really, after Ulysses Grant left office, um, no president in American history fought harder, and I'm including, some might take objection to this, but there's no question in my mind. No president in American history fought harder for equal rights for African Americans, for Black Americans, uh, um, than William McKinley did, all the way from 1877, when Grant left office, all the way up to the 1960s. And I'm including Franklin Roosevelt in that. No president fought harder for civil rights and equal rights for Black Americans than McKinley did. Um, so I'm going to have to. Ooh, 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 ooh. Um, well, I might run a little bit over, but um, on it's also the case that on this question of labor and uh, uh, you know uh, understanding the importance of a productive workforce, not simply for the national economy, but for what it meant for the people, for the citizenry to be productive, um, the identity, the self-worth, the self-respect of a productive citizenry. Um, McKinley uh, always supported trade unions. Trade unions were sort of new, but they existed. One of his closest political allies throughout decades was Terence Powderly, the head of the Knights of Labor. And later, when he was president, um, he appointed Powderly to be the head of the immigration at Ellis Island in New York City. But he always supported trade unions, and he always supported free productive labor. And I want to read to you a short quote um, um, from a speech he gave on tariffs and labor. This was at the University of Pennsylvania. He said, "Some say everything would be so cheap if we only had free trade. Well, everything would be cheap, but everybody would be cheap. I do not prize the word cheap. It is not a word of hope. It is not a word of comfort. It is not a word of cheer. It is not a word of inspiration. It is the badge of poverty. It is the signal of distress. And there is not a white-haired man in this audience who, if he will let his memory go back, will not recall that when things were the cheapest, men were the poorest. Cheap. Why, cheap merchandise means cheap men, and cheap men mean a cheap country. And that is not the kind of government our fathers founded, and it is not the kind their sons mean to maintain. If you want cheap things, go somewhere else where you can get them. We want labor to be well paid." And so that's one quote from him. Um, uh, and I could go into a long discussion of McKinley's record on civil rights, but maybe we'll get into that in the question and answer period, because I do want to read to you. Um, uh, well, I think I will do it, and we'll end that way. I mean, the best thing is to just read to you some of the quotes from McKinley, um, uh, because really I want to try to give you, when I say there's no one like him other than Lincoln or up until Donald Trump, there's no one like him other than Lincoln or Washington. I really mean it. And so the best way to convey that, I think, is with McKinley's own words. So I will read to you some stuff on the question of his fight for civil rights. Um, it may not be the most important thing he did as president, but I think, well, for some people it was, but I think it gives you a sense of his character. In the first speech he gave, public speech, very first public speech, he was young, he was in his 20s, was in 1867. Um, and the It was entitled "On Black Equality." So this is right after the Civil War. And I'll read you two paragraphs from it. Um, he said, "My friends and fellow citizens, I speak for my comrades of the Grand Army of the Republic. The settlements of that war must stand as the irreversible judgment of battle and the inflexible decree of a nation of free men. They must not be misinterpreted. They must not be nullified. They must not be weakened or shorn of their force under any pretext whatsoever. It must not be equality and justice in the written law only. It must be equality and justice in the law's administration everywhere, and alike administered in every part of the republic to every citizen thereof. It must be a living birthright. Our black allies must neither be forsaken nor deserted. I weigh my words. This is the great question, not only of the present, but of the great question of the future. And this question will never be settled until it is settled upon principles of justice, recognizing the sanctity of the Constitution of the United States. We have no bitterness against the people of the South. We want them to be our brothers, not only in name, but in spirit and heart. We bid them enjoy our we bid them enjoy equally our prosperity. But at the same time, we bid them obey the Constitution of this republic. So that's on that. But I want to end with two other. I mean, there's only so much you can fit in 45 minutes or an hour. I want to end with two other quotes from McKinley. I'm going to have to read them. You know, I can't, no other way around it. Um, uh, in McKinley gave a speech, and I'm not sure of the subject of the speech, but he gave a speech in Connecticut in 1891. He was still in Congress at this time, I believe. I don't think he was the governor of Ohio yet, but he gave a speech in Connecticut in 1891, really where I think this is one of his better speeches on his concept of his his view of the American Republic. And I'll read you two paragraphs from it. It is a common thing to say, but a good thing to say, because it is true that we have the best government in the world. It represents the best thought and the best civilization. Even more, it represents the hope and future of all mankind. And yet, it has never been as good as its principles. It was not so from the beginning, and it is not so now. Our principles are always better than our practices. This is true of individuals as well as nations. But I say, principles must always lead. They are the advanced guard of right thought and action. The Declaration of Independence, which sounded the voice of liberty to all mankind, was in advance of the thought of the great body of the people. It took 100 years of national life and national thought and earnest agitation, and at last a long, wasting war to place this government where the Declaration of Independence anchored it. There must, I repeat, be a remedy for every wrong, a road somewhere and somehow to be found, which leads us to righteousness. We can only pursue the right as it appears to us. The rest we can leave to others. And the ultimate victory may be nearer than we think. When Lincoln entered upon the execution of his great office in the turbulent year of 1861, he had not yet formulated the immortal Proclamation of Emancipation. When Grant started upon his final campaign against Lee in front of Richmond, he had not thought of that famous letter of terms of surrender. Every great historical event in the world's progress has had its preceding steps. Those who guided and directed could not always foresee with precision the outcome in the end. They only knew what seemed right and true to them. And so, pursuing the right and the truth, mighty epochs have been marked in the world's history and mighty results achieved for mankind. So that's from the second inaugural. And what I'm going to conclude with is a couple of paragraphs from McKinley's second inaugural address. This is in March of 1901. and um, uh, I'll just read it. The path of progress is seldom smooth. New things are often found hard to do. Our fathers found them so. We find them so. They are inconvenient. They cost us something. But are we not made better for the effort and sacrifice? And are not those we serve lifted up and blessed? We will be consoled too with the fact that opposition has confronted every onward movement of the Republic from its opening hour until now, but without success. The Republic has marched on, and its step has exalted freedom and humanity. We are undergoing the same ordeal as did our predecessors more than a century ago. We are following the course they blazed. They triumphed. Will their successors falter and plead impotency in the nation? Surely, after 125 years of achievement for mankind, we will not now surrender our equality with other powers on matters of matters fundamental and essential to our nation. With no such purpose was this nation created. In no such spirit has it developed its full and independent sovereignty. We adhere to the principle of equality among ourselves and equality among nations, and by no act of ours will we assign to ourselves a subordinate rank in the family of nations. So that's from his second inaugural address. And I think you could see why the British murdered him. And I'll just conclude. I mean, I don't want to lessen the impact of McKinley's words, but I will just conclude with, I think it is useful to reflect on this, um, to bring into this, and I don't think it's incorrect to do so. Um, Asking people to think back and remember Donald Trump's speech at the United Nations, where he said, the future does not belong to the globalists. The future belongs to sovereign nations. And then to look at what Trump is doing today, where he is essentially teaching, it's like a teaching moment. He's teaching nations all over the world how to be sovereign again, how to recover their own sovereignty, you know, to resurrect this principle. And that's what he's doing. So I just scratched the surface. But why don't I stop? And why don't we open it up for discussion?
Terrific.